There is a fifth dimension.
About the unknown.
Beyond that which is known to man.
The Garden of Thought.
The Babylon Project was our last best hope for peace.
Unexplained.
Mythologies.
This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call
The Garden of Thought with Jeff Lippman.
Eventually, our sun will grow cold and go out.
You're listening to something much bigger, something hidden in plain sight.
It won't just take us. It'll take Marilyn Monroe and Lao Tzu and Einstein. All of us was for nothing unless we go to the stars.
What you're about to learn will completely change the way you experience your mind, your thoughts, and yourself.
Let's make sure that history never forgets the name.
The Garden of Thought.
Welcome everyone into Garden of Thought. This week we are going back into Africa and we're visiting again with Kush, Punt, and Nubia, and maybe places that you've heard their names or haven't heard their names before. A few episodes back we talked to our good friend Mogg Morgan, who's certainly an independent researcher and historian and magician of renown, as well as an author. But today we're going to get from the academic standpoint, and let's see how those two things overlay. Our guest today is Dr. Stuart Tyson Smith. He is a PhD in archaeology, and I believe University of California, San Bernardino, is that right?
Yeah, Santa Barbara.
Santa Barbara. I knew there was a B in there. I mean, I could have just switched tabs to my Facebook, which I have open. But, that would have given, I would have lost the opportunity of making an embarrassing mistake right there. So, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey on this path, and then we'll jump into wherever you tell us to jump into.
Well, I'm a professor of anthropology at University of California, Santa Barbara, and I'm a field archaeologist, so I spent a lot of time working initially in Egypt, but I got interested in the South and Nubia while I was a graduate student, because I ran into a collection from the Aswan High Dam salvage campaign that had been kind of languishing at UCLA, which is where I got my PhD. And that got me interested in kind of Egyptian imperialism in Nubia, so the northern part of Egypt and the southern part of Sudan. And then subsequently interested in the kind of interactions between the two civilizations and the kind of back and forth and kind of cultural entanglements and intertwinings that ensued. And so I got interested in exploring that further, so I spent a long time working in Sudan at the site of an ancient Egyptian colony. So I've excavated there. That also lasted after the colonial era ended. And so that process of it was established as a colony during the New Kingdom about 1450 BCE. Egypt had a huge, expansive empire.
Right, we're talking about Egyptian colonization of Nubia. We're not talking about British or French or what a colonization in the
exactly.
1600s or
about 3,500 years ago. So
right,
so imperialism, colonialism, not new.
Right,
they were doing it back then. So anyway, and kind of post-colonial era when interesting things were happening, and the rise of the Kushite dynasty who ruled Egypt for about 100 years, from 750 to 650 BCE. And then, unfortunately, with the civil war in Sudan, I've been a little stalled, but
sure.
Because I can't go back. It's too dangerous right now. I know one team, Polish team, is working there, but otherwise, risky because the Civil War is still very much hot and ongoing. But I have started on a project in Egypt at Karnak Temple, which is a pretty amazing place. Just looking at a small temple that was built by some of these Kushite pharaohs, Nubian pharaohs, and so that's been fun, and it's allowed me to still do archaeology in spite of that. And then I guess just one sort of trivia about me is that when I was actually not quite, I'd just gotten my PhD at UCLA and got a call from some Hollywood producers working on a film called Stargate. And so I joined the film crew there, and I most of what I did for the film, apart from working on a lot of the Daniel Jackson's dialogue played by James Spader, was great to work with. I translated the dialogue into ancient Egyptian, and I happened to have studied with someone who was interested in what original pronunciation sounded like. So I reconstructed it in a way consistent with what it really would have been pronounced as, which is very different from the way Egyptologists do it.
Oh.
And then later on, one of the actors in Stargate was in The Mummy, so I also consulted for that film and its sequel, The Mummy Returns.
Okay, so we're talking about that mummy, the Brandon Fraser mummy,
not
the Tom Cruise.
No, not. I want to make it clear, definitely not the Tom Cruise one, which is not the best film.
Yeah, I didn't hate it as much as most people hated it, but I was prepared to really, really hate it. So I guess the benefit of low expectations. Anyway, I'm not suggesting anyone rush out and watch it, but if you're bored at 11 o'clock at night and you can't fall asleep, it's not the worst expenditure of 2 hours of time.
I saw it on a plane, which was a good use of a couple hours of a long haul flight.
Yeah, I think a plane ride. There's a pass. Anything you see on a plane ride is a better use of time being alone with your thoughts with ear pressure.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I really think that more people should be interested or even be aware of this type of history. And I'm sure as time goes on and the region stabilizes and, sort of sadly as it develops economically and gets more stable, there'll be the usual building of infrastructure and unnecessary structures and things like Starbucks and Qdobas and things like that. But, and environmental spoilage, but that also allows for science to go in and there'll be accidental discoveries to be found and all there's good and bad with those things. And we may find things that are older or at least different. Maybe even they're newer, but they just add to the picture. I also really enjoy the study of Africa. I mean, I read a book by it's called The History of Africa, and it's fairly new by an African scholar who I believe she's Kenyan and Rwandan. I might be wrong, but she's in Zimbabwe now. So, and it's just very interesting because I don't know. I feel if people studied more things like that and just took things, we get a little bit less mad about things now. It's not to whitewash history or the past or anything like that. But like you said, people were doing it then. And even the ancient Egyptians, when they were talking about different people, they were not categorized, but they were describing them by physical characteristics. And you could see that, people saying Egypt was black. Well, no, the Egyptians wrote that, it was multicultural and they described, different people from different areas as being multicultural. And then people go, Jesus is black. No, Jesus is white. No, Jesus is brown. No, Jesus is, and yeah, I mean, acting like just because he was from, the Levant, that necessarily means that he was brown, as if there wasn't Greek, Egyptian, Roman, Persian, Canaanite, Turkish, all sorts of different kinds of, peoples there that mixed and mingled just like everyone else. I mean, for all we know, he looked like The Rock and Mary Magdalene looked like J-Lo. I mean, they could have been, good looking, but I'm sure they were good looking anyway, and that's probably not important. Anyway, I digress. Which is, just like the Nile and its cataracts, that's my specialty is to digress. So maybe we should start with what and where is Nubia?
So Nubia is along the Nile, although there are Nubians who are a little bit more out into the desert, but it's generally from the first cataract of the Nile in southern Egypt at Aswan, which still has Nubians today. So that's one thing to note, is that it's an ancient people and region, but it's also a modern people and region, but divided between two states, so Egypt and Sudan. So the southern part of Egypt from Aswan south to the border is Egyptian Nubia, and then the northern part of Sudan. In ancient times, it would have stretched all the way from the confluence of the two Niles, the White and the Blue Nile at Khartoum, and maybe even a little bit farther south than that, all the way up through Egypt to Aswan. But today, the effective range of where Nubians live is down to the bottom of the Great Bend of the Nile. So I don't know, you can picture the Nile, it goes down and then it cuts back up again, and then cuts, does a big kind of S curve and then heads south again.
And that's where Khartoum is, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then Khartoum is farther down, and the two Niles joining.
Yeah,
that big bend, so it's at the bottom of it. So
I only know that because I read a book by a guy named Wilburn Smith. He's wrote a million, books. They're all the same. But he wrote that Khartoum means elephant trunk, and so that was what they saw the shape of the Nile where the city was at some point. So so when everyone says the bend of the Nile, I have a pretty good guess that it's Khartoum.
Yeah. Well, it's downstream from Khartoum, but so it would be if you're thinking of the trunk as a curvy thing, it would be at the closer to the tip of the trunk,
right.
And then the Khartoum would be at the base of the trunk, kind of curving up like this.
Yeah. Okay. So it's at the tip where like the trunk would meet, where like a human's nose would be over the mouth, as opposed to the tip like where they would get their grass from.
Yeah, where Khartoum would be. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that would be back there. So, but anyway, we talk about it in ancient times as a region that stretches all the way from the first cataract of the Nile in Aswan to Khartoum.
Is Nubian an acronym, or is it a word that they use themselves?
That's a very good question, and it's complicated, as so many things are. So the first reference to the basic term in Greek sources is about 300 BCE, and we have similarly the first use of a term that sounds like Nubia. There's some debate as to the exact origins, but probably a Nubian word, Noba, which referred to kind of like how you would translate it, maybe something like the masses. So like, ordinary people, not rich, wealthy people. And so we see that term being used, and in the Greek sources, they refer to it as an ethnonym. So specifically say that these people lived along the Nile.
Okay.
So that's the earliest use of that term. Earlier, we have another term that is used by people in the region, and that's Kush.
Okay, so Nubians and Kushites, at least to a certain extent, are the same ancestral people. At some point, they were the same people.
Yeah, exactly. And typically, we use Nubia and Nubians in a broad way to encompass some cultural diversity, but like there are different sort of flavors of Nubian, if you will. So different groups. Some of the names we know, like Medjay, which is were sort of semi-nomadic pastoralists living out in the desert, interacting with Egypt and Kushites as well. But there's a different ethnic group. But eventually, Kush became the sort of general term in antiquity for the region up until about 300 BCE, and then we start seeing references to Nubia. And then by the medieval era, so like the 1300s in Europe, they were, if you find a map from that era that includes Africa, it'll include Nubia.
Right. Yeah.
So there were a series of Christian kingdoms at that point in time that were important trading centers, and so they get recognized in some very early European maps.
Yeah. Well, the term Nubian, I believe, appears in the Bible, so that would be an obvious one to sort of group it. I also learned, because I'm never sure if I'm correct, that the word Libya actually was like either the Greek or Roman word or but it just meant Africa. And, now it's a country next to Egypt. But it was just the generic word for Africa writ large. I think at some point Nubian was sort of what people referred to as Africans, and possibly they meant sub-Saharan Africans versus sort of Egyptian, Carthaginian, maybe even up to Ethiopia, I guess, with the, Semitic peoples. I'm not sure. I'm guessing here.
Yeah, actually, you're thinking of the term Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is used in the classical world to refer to everything, south of Egypt, basically.
Oh, okay.
Africa. Even sometimes Egypt is sort of encompassed by.
So not Libya.
Well, it could be Libya had the same use, but Ethiopia is definitely, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa.
I'm gonna go with you would know over me. I'm gonna go with that one. I was told at some point, I think it's in that same book that I was referencing earlier, where she said that what was classical Ethiopia is not the country of Ethiopia now.
Exactly. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So, in fact, normally Ethiopia, as I say, can be a more generic term for things, in Africa, but specifically it's often used to refer to ancient Kush.
Okay.
So, and it is Kush in the Bible, not Nubia. So Nubia is, as far as I know, it's not mentioned. I could be wrong about that because I'm not a biblical scholar. But it's definitely Kush. The Table of Nations, when Noah spreads out after the flood, and, one of the offspring is named Kush.
So Kush would not be a Hamite, or would Kush be a Hamite, or we're not going to get into the Bible here?
We're starting to get a little bit beyond my expertise, but I believe he would be. I think Kush would be part of that.
I never knew the Bible was so.
Sure, I don't want to say definitively, and then I'm wrong.
Yeah. I never knew the Bible was so interesting until this show, but I mean, I don't know. I'm sorry, but it's unreadable. So, maybe it was, great flowing literature back then, but it's completely unreadable now. I understand why there's Bible study groups, because you need like people there to push you to do it and pretend that you, love it and enjoy it. I don't know. I'm going to stop myself now. Where does the word punt fit in, or does it at all?
Yeah, so Punt is then what the ancient Egyptians called a place along the Red Sea. And it was an important trading partner for products that sort of match up with the Horn of Africa. So things like incense, particularly incense, which would have been, that's kind of the range of incense. It's the southern Arabian Peninsula, Yemen and that area, and then Oman as well, were important producers of frankincense and myrrh, which are the two most prized forms of incense. And that runs into Africa, so the southern part of Sudan, Ethiopia, and that area also is home to those particular trees. And so that incense, frankincense, and myrrh is the sap of those trees. And then you burn it, and it smells really nice. Yeah. And so highly prized. They were also getting gold and other things from there. And there probably was an overland route, but they were mostly sailing on the Red Sea. So they had several ports along the Red Sea coast, which was could be logistically challenging to support because it's really barren there. But they, would ship in, bring in supplies. They probably portaged the dismantled ships to the coast and then built them because they didn't have a direct connection between the Nile or the Mediterranean and the Red Sea at that point in time. And then they would sail down the coast. And at this point, most scholars think that the area they're referring to is Eritrea. So that kind of breakaway part of Ethiopia, sort of along that coast, the northern coast of the Horn. But Somalia would be another possibility, probably a little less likely. But both regions, because they've been so troubled over the past, pretty much the entire time I've been around anyway, there hasn't been enough archaeology done. There was some promising work done in Eritrea a few years back, and that was, gave us a strong hint that conclusion is correct, that that's where Punt should be. but major trading partner for ancient Egypt.
I would guess that borders were clearly different back then than they are now, but I would imagine that borders generally were more fluid than they are now.
Yeah, that's true. And, a little less precise. I mean, they still had senses of boundaries, but particularly for a place like Punt, they didn't really give specific, limits to it. In the Middle East, you had, these massive empires and states and city-states, and they had pretty well-defined boundaries, but still there was a lot of bleed. They weren't formally enforced in the same way that a modern boundary is today. Although even modern boundaries are kind of permeable, so it's still, so they're political constructs, right? So people either pay attention to them or not, depending on what they want to do.
And depending on if there's guys with machine guns there also.
Yeah, exactly. But even that, then you just go around where the machine guns are and people get in. And we even see that with ancient Egypt when they created boundaries along the Nile. One of the things they were worried about is people going, popping out into the desert and just going around. So they sent out patrols and things, but clearly, they wouldn't have sent out patrols if people weren't doing it, right?
Sure.
So people were smuggling and, getting around any kind of restrictions, even back then. And of course, that continues on today. So,
and those became trade routes later,
Yeah, exactly. But, definitely not as formally outlined. And then, you have these key points where kind of geopolitical choke points, if you will, where you have more of like a hardened frontier, but the rest of it, like out in the desert, there were no firm law.
Like an isthmus over a river, or where it's shallowest, and or where where there's like goat or paths in the mountains that are already hewn down a little bit, or whatever kind of herd animal that are on their own before there were human herd animals. Yeah, that all makes sense. Are there any other neighbors or neighborhoods with names that we've probably not heard of, or maybe didn't realize we're referring to, what we call an ancient land or culture that we should?
Yeah, there is a place called Yam in ancient Egyptian records, and for a long time, Egyptologists thought it must be Nubia, which was partly, this problem with the history and archaeology of Africa, which haven't read that book you may be aware of, is that because, there aren't as many historical accounts, and the archaeology has always been difficult in most of Africa, apart from, say, Egypt and along northern Africa, like Libya, people just default said, well, it must be Nubia, because it was this, some kind of a kingdom that the Egyptians were negotiating with and trading with. But recently, an inscription was found out way out in the desert in the northwestern corner of Sudan, so right at the border between Chad, Sudan, Libya, and Egypt, about an expedition that was going to treat with the king of Yam. And there were earlier accounts of expedition leaders, in particular a guy named Harkuf from Aswan, who led expeditions to Yam, where he acquired all sorts of the classic products of the South, so ivory, ebony, all these kind of savanna environment, products, but also a dancing pygmy for the king's court.
Oh, lovely.
Because apparently, if you want to do the dances of the gods, you got to have a pygmy, or a dwarf. A dwarf could do too. But
you don't make the rules.
Yeah, exactly. But there is an argument that it was actually a pygmy, because there are two different words, and it looks like it's a diminutive person rather than someone with a dwarf and the kind of particular physiognomy that folks have. And so as a result, people have redefined where Yam must be, and it's probably Chad.
Okay.
Which is really interesting, because it means the ancient Egyptians must have had a much wider reach within Northeast Africa than people had given them credit for. And this is at a time when the Sahara was not quite as wet as it is today, but was nevertheless a desert, as opposed to a few thousand years earlier, say 5000 BCE, and Harkuf is about 2200 BCE. So 5000 BCE, it was grassland. There was rainfall all throughout the Sahara, so it wasn't a desert. It was seasonal grasslands, savanna lands were much farther north. But by Harhuf's time, he had to actually cross the desert, and he did it using donkey caravans.
Nice.
No camels.
Right. Camels came later. If they were introduced by Arabia, I believe.
Right. And archaeologists have found these amazing kind of way stations. There's one that was operated during the time of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, or for whom the Great Pyramid was built, I should say. I'm sure he didn't lift a stone or do much of anything
right.
except watch and say, "Good job, guy."
Right.
But
maybe the last one, and everyone's like, "Oh, yay, good job!"
Exactly, yeah, that's it.
That's the best stone yet, my lord.
Yeah, exactly so. But yeah, it must have been like the worst posting in the Egyptian bureaucracy / army. It's out literally in the middle of the desert, at this very distinctive sort of rock outcrop, kind of small mountain that you could see for a long distance if you were traveling across the desert. And they found hundreds and hundreds of pots there, and they were big water jars. So what they would do is run donkeys in from the Nile. And donkeys are great. They can carry huge burdens. They do really well in arid environments because they were domesticated in East Africa. So they're perfect for the ecology, very well suited. But you got to water them more often than you do camels. So camels, the big advantage with camels is you can run them longer.
Right.
Donkeys can carry just as much. In fact, per animal, a lot more than a camel. They're really amazing creatures. If you've ever seen them in real life, and they're still widely used in the region.
Donkey, I rode one up Santorini.
There you go.
Or down.
So,
no, up. Yeah. I was definitely too afraid to ride it down.
Yeah. So they were running these caravans, hundreds of donkeys carrying all this produce, but initially just water. So then you could run the donkeys out, water them, and then refill those as the caravan was going on, to a place like Chad or Western Sudan, Darfur today. And then when you run them back, you water them again, and you get back. So amazing effort put into going these places. And there were places like this where they found this inscription, a place called that place at the corner of those countries is called Huwainat, and which still has water today. So there were these wells and spots, so you go between wells, and then but so amazing amount of planning, and probably Nubians were very much engaged in this kind of activity. There's some Nubians who are mentioned as connected with these kind of journeys, which makes sense because you have that kind of pastoral component that I was mentioning earlier, and people just familiar with the South and the sort of wider world of that part of Africa.
Right. 2 questions. I hope they're small questions before we get into our main event. But what was the state and size of Lake Chad at the time, and what was the state and size of like Carthage, which is like the other known maybe for a brief shining moment as being a great African continent culture that could have been Rome if not for certain events. But I mean, just because they got sacked doesn't mean that they disappeared. And I fully understand that we're probably, some of this we're talking about thousands of years later, or at least hundreds of years later. But anyway, those questions.
Yeah, so good questions. I don't know as much about Carthage. It was certainly a major city, and of course, it's much, much later. So the time of Rome,
right.
And definitely challenged Rome's supremacy in the Mediterranean world, and of course eventually lost out. Although there was an important civilization, whose name eludes me right now, across North Africa. It was Carthage, and there was a whole group of people again during this period.
Atlantis.
Pardon?
Atlantis.
Yeah, but no, not Atlantis.
Oh, okay.
But there was a major kind of civilization in North Africa during this period that interacted with Roman Empire and so on. In terms of Lake Chad, it would have been really big during this period of, it's often referred to as the Green Sahara. So this period when the rainfall was coming up from the Indian Ocean, which is where you get rainfall in that part of Africa today, where in the areas that are still watered, like Uganda and especially Ethiopia. That's what really feeds the Nile flood every year, is the rainfall comes up from the Indian Ocean during the summer, which is a little counterintuitive for us because we think of winter as the rainy season. But and cold season, but it was exactly the opposite, both in ancient Egypt and in that part of the world. So the rain comes up through there, but instead of stopping, about halfway through Sudan, it continued almost all the way up to the Mediterranean during that period of time. So Lake Chad was a super lake. It was huge.
Okay.
Way larger than it was before.
Was it freshwater?
And then
yes. Okay, so it was always a lake then.
Yeah, and I believe today it's still freshwater. So I think which just means it has outlets. So
yeah,
it's not trapped in there and then evaporating. It still gets fed by rainfall and so on.
But it's shrinking. I hear it shrinks every year.
Yeah, so it has shrunk. I don't know what the current state of it is now and how much they're using it for irrigation. I know I did talk to an archaeologist who poked around there and just done what we call a reconnaissance survey. So you just basically walk around, talk to people, see what's there. And he thought it was promising, but again, Chad has been racked by civil war for decades now and all sorts of problems. So I know a couple people who've worked there, but it's really hard. And so we don't know much. It would be really interesting to know what existed there. Nothing in terms of like grand monuments like pyramids, but that doesn't mean there wasn't, a pretty complex society there with cities and some kind of monuments. But
hey, Stonehenge is pretty small, but people still talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. So things on that scale, those could be buried, or made if they were made out of materials that erode or are perishable.
Yeah,
you could find traces of all that archaeologically, but there just hasn't been much archaeology done there.
Like wood.
Yeah, exactly.
Pretty common in the forests.
Yes.
Okay, on to our main event. So tell us, what do we need to know about, or what should we know about Kush as to, what are the beginnings of history of Kush, and by history I mean where we have, sort of figured it out, the general consensus of, some archaeology that can tell us about a settlement that is surrounded by what we call culture, the temples, palaces, some sort of infrastructure.
Yeah, so a good question. So there, just one thing to keep in mind moving forward is that during this period of the Green Sahara, so about 5000 BCE, you had a whole group of interacting cultures that existed that were founded on pastoralism, particularly cattle pastoralism. So we see a lot of cattle symbolism, for example, in Egypt. Think of the cow goddess Hathor, one of the most important ones.
Sure.
Who has cow's ears and cow's horns and whatnot. So, and you think of cow milk fertility, makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
Particularly if you're a pastoralist, right? And similarly, the king is often referred to as strong bull and all with these kind of symbolisms. You have that sort of thing going on in Nubia as well.
Yeah, so didn't the Sumerians, only the gods could be depicted with horns, but it wasn't Sargon, but like one of his near descendants all of a sudden put horns on his crest and said, hey, we're gods on earth too. And then that I guess that concept sort of took to this very day.
Yes. It's always a good line to say, no, I'm a god. Really, you should believe me and do everything I say.
Right. Didn't you get measles when you were a kid? That wasn't me.
Exactly. So the earliest Nubian, in this case, I would say Nubian just because Kush didn't exist yet, is right about the time you see Pharaonic civilization coalescing. So what is often referred to as the sort of pre-dynastic period or Nagata period. In Egypt, you have a group in Nubia called the A group, and they are centered on the southern part of Egypt. And there we do have evidence of monumental tombs, not so much settlement stuff. There are settlements that were probably a bit smaller in scale. They may have been a little bit more pastoralist, say, than ancient Egyptian. But at the same time, in Egypt, you see a series of small kingdoms developing and eventually unified under kings like Narmer and later on Menes. You see this other civilization in Nubia called the A group, just because the archaeologist George Reisner around 100 years ago was just not feeling very inspired, so he just made a sequence of A group, B group, C group, going all the way to X group, although there aren't many in between A group and X group.
Oh, yeah, no Z.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, he came up with this simplistic terminology, but that's what we call them. And they seem to have been a pretty complex civilization. Like I said, they have these massive burial mounds called tumuli, which has a long tradition in both Egypt and Nubia, but Egypt sort of drifted away from them. I mean, you could think of actually pyramids as kind of giant tumuli, so burial mounds, effectively. But with somewhat different symbolism and so on, but probably coming from a similar tradition.
Sure, building the Tower of Babel, building artificial mountains to the gods, and of course you put your living gods in a tomb that's fit for a god to live. Just because they died on Earth doesn't mean that they're not still living there. And I mean, isn't that sort of why they pack them with like treasures, stuff, and people?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So you see that.
Talk about a bad duty. I mean, I'm sure it was considered an honor, and the people probably brainwashed, like the what were the fighting people in Game of Thrones? Like they were eunuchs, but they were trained to be warriors from the beginning.
Yeah.
I can't remember. The Unsullied. So it's probably like the Unsullied. They never knew any other way, so they're probably like, yes, to be buried alive in here guarding our Lord and Pharaoh is a awesome thing, but it's like, I don't know. I'll pick that desert posting, waiting for the donkeys to come around over like being entombed with a bunch of other dudes, farting until the food runs out.
Yeah. Yeah. So you do have that kind of human sacrifice in the first dynasty of Egypt, first two dynasties really, but mainly the first dynasty. So right at the beginning, but then it stops. So they don't, by the time they're building the Great Pyramid, no human sacrifices. You do see it in Nubia appearing not at the very beginning. So this civilization in Nubia that had its start and was kind of like on a par with developments in Egypt, with these smaller kingdoms that were a bit fragmented. But when Egypt unified, then they basically squished Nubia. So
right.
Their accounts of invading and so on, and archaeologically settlement in that southern part of Egypt, from Aswan to the border with Sudan, basically disappears, except for little traces of maybe some people still, engaging in pastoralism out in the desert. But the Egyptians, once they formed the pharaonic state, maybe as a part of border policing, I don't know, they wanted to create a kind of buffer zone between themselves and things that were developing farther south. But they seem to have done the same in Sinai. So they pushed north into Sinai, cleared the area of the local people who were living there at the time, and then established some, not too permanent, but some kind of like trading entrepot colonies, you could call them, in southern Israel. And then similarly in that part of Nubia, they established some kind of settlements, maybe for mining metals, copper and gold.
So you'd have like other land, quarries sort of around there, sort of trading posts, villages, kind of, your south of the border, Stop at Pedro's kind of places, or Niagara, Dollywood, and then sort of behind them, sort of garrison forts or things, and then nothingness for a while until you get to the border where there's more garrisons and and maybe less and less Stop at Pedro's. Maybe there's like, one Sheets and a Wawa and don't make yourself, no motels, don't make yourself at home.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's when we first get this idea of, a more modern concept of border.
Yeah.
But again, still permeable with people moving around and all of that, but
sure.
Not quite as formalized as the modern nation state's border is, but kind of similar in many ways. And then after that period, the next biggest sort of kingdom we see in Nubia is a place called Kerma, which is the sort of first time we see a reference to this toponym and ethnonym Kush and Kushite.
Okay.
And there at Kerma, in fact, it's very close to where I have been excavating in Sudan. So this Egyptian colony that was put in about 1450 BCE was put in about 10 kilometers north of this major capital city. So you see it growing up between about the same time as the A group and the early Egypt. We see like a big town, but not as formal a city, and no indication that it was a centralized kingdom.
And Khartoum wasn't there yet, right?
Yeah, Khartoum would have been. There were people around. But,
sure. I mean, not as a major city, And what about Egypt? There are names, there's, I don't know if Cairo existed yet, but there's Memphis, there's Luxor, there's Thebes, there's Saqqara, there's Karnak. I don't know where these places. I'm not trying to do them in order because I have no idea what order they are, but I know that some of them are close to the South Egyptian, North Sudanese border, maybe in modern Sudan, for all I know. And didn't Akhenaten try to move down to what I guess would be Sudan now, or maybe just north of it, and that didn't go so well?
No, I'll give you a quick geography going along.
Yeah, please.
The preeminent center in the north of Egypt was Memphis, which is just opposite Saqqara. So you can see Saqqara with the step pyramid and later pyramids, huge necropolis for serving the capital city. And you could actually see Giza from Memphis.
Okay.
So you can see the Great Pyramids off in the distance, but those are a bit north. And then going upstream, you eventually go to various places.
But upstream is south, is moving south.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
Which is always, even I get confused sometimes.
Right.
And give the wrong direction. But yes, it's one of those rivers that flows from the south to the north, which is a little weird conceptually because only rivers go the other way. But, so they going south, there were a string of cities, but kind of modest in scale, but sometimes with big temples, like Abydos, the place where Osiris, his cult was worshipped. He was worshipped, the sort of god of the dead and dead kings.
Yeah, and then bad fallen angels are imprisoned there.
Yeah, and then farther south, the major center you get is ancient Thebes. Which is today Luxor, and that's where Karnak is, the Valley of the Kings, and so on.
Okay.
And that was always, so the two main cities in Egypt were always those two, Memphis in the north, Thebes in the south.
Can I ask a dumb question about Thebes? Because I know this is a place in Greece called Thebes. Did the Greeks name Thebes? Is it just an absolute coincidence? They just sound the same, so we pronounce them the same? Or is it two cultures came up with the same name of a city that sounds the same, but there's no rhyme or reason for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is simply that the Greeks arrived there, they looked at the city, and they went, hey, that looks like Thebes.
Oh, okay.
And so they called it Thebes.
So the Egyptians at the time didn't call it Thebes. I don't know if they called themselves Egyptians at the time, but okay, very good. They probably didn't call themselves Egyptian. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, they call themselves the people.
Okay, well, hey.
In the way of most people. They also would sometimes refer to Egypt as Kemet, which literally means the black land.
Right.
And a reference to the rich soils of the Nile Valley, which when they get wet, they look really black.
But that's in distinction to something I imagine we're going to get to it. There's the Black Pharoahs, which actually were, what we call now Sudanese or Kushite or Nubian Pharoahs, right? Who were, more what you'd consider sub-Saharan African.
Yes and no. It's the actual physiognomy is complicated.
Okay, even the Black Pharaohs part isn't necessarily because they were darker in hue than the Egyptians of the north.
Yeah, they would have been darker in hue than the Egyptians. You can see that today. But when they're represented, they tend to be represented with what we would consider a quote unquote sub-Saharan physiognomy. But the actual distribution of things like skin color and nose shape and so on is complicated in two ways. One is through a kind of evolutionary process called clines. And this is just, so skin color is absolutely an adaptation to sunlight. So the natural state of humans is actually dark. And as humans spread out north, like my ancestors who ended up in England and Ireland, being dark skinned means you don't get a lot of vitamin D because all the sunlight's absorbed and so on. So light skin evolved as a consequence of that. And I can tell you from personal experience that North Africa is not a happy place for people of my complexion because I always have to wear like a big floppy hat and a scarf and whatnot, and I had the sort of little minor skin cancers.
Right, you just call yourself Jacqueline Bisset and be done with it.
Exactly so, yeah. So that evolved earlier. But what happens is because it's evolutionary, because it's responds to natural selection, what you get is people around the equator, you can trace this all the way around the world, are dark because that's well adapted to that sort of environment. But as you get farther and farther north, people get lighter. As you get farther and farther south, people get lighter too. So you don't think about this much, but like in South Africa, the farther south you get, the indigenous peoples there also get lighter than the people in the quote unquote sub-Saharan Africa, let's say the tropical zone of Africa, tend to be the darkest. And similar with nose shape. So pointier noses are an adaptation to aridity, and that can be cold aridity, like winters where it's really dry.
Right.
You get that not a lot of moisture in the air. It's all locked up in frozen stuff. Or a place like North Africa, where you get a very dry climate. But then at the same time, people move around a lot more than we give them credit for.
Right.
In the past, people could still move, and especially with something like the Nile, where you got the river, people could move along with great facility along that.
They could even move back. I mean, they could do
exactly, yeah. So people move around in the way of people, they got together, had children.
Right.
And so like you were saying before, you can see ancient Egypt as, but, you can kind of extend this almost everywhere. But in particular, Egypt, because of its situation, within Africa, you get a multicultural, multi-ethnic society, much more so than we think of, partly because the Egyptians created this conception of Egypt and sort of mapped it in a certain way to emphasize contrast between the peoples around them. But when we start actually looking at what was going on in ancient Egypt, we can see that it was not this sort of, not this kind of homogenous place, but in fact, you have a lot of diversity, both cultural, but also you would have, just as you do today, see a lot of difference in physical appearance. So, for example, if you go from the Nile Delta to Aswan in the south, you can really see this clinal distribution of skin color. Now, any one individual could be lighter or darker, depending on their ancestry and where, people moved around and so on. But you see that general trend as you go farther south, people get darker. And similar in Sudan, as you go farther south, people get darker. You go into the tropical zone, then they have also, other characteristics that we associate with, sub-Saharan Africans more broadly. But you'll see people, distributed around because people move, people have kids, and that all appears. And that's one thing to note about ancient Egypt and Nubia, in spite of the official state ideology of otherness, of are they created Egyptians versus Nubians versus Libyans versus people from Western Asia, Canaanites, and so on. In fact, Egypt was Nubians were in Egypt, for example, from the very beginning.
Right.
And we have reference to that. We can see Nubians as a part of Egyptian society. And they still are sometimes depicted with that kind of Nubian stereotype, if you will, but also sometimes shown with Nubian dress and whatnot on things that they created themselves or they commissioned. So they're kind of self-representing themselves as, in a way, Egyptian, because they're like on a funerary stela, for example. They're in the typical pose that you would expect for an Egyptian. All the texts are ancient Egyptian, reflecting, Egyptian beliefs in the afterlife and so on. But they might show themselves with a leather sash to make them kind of looking Nubian, and jewelry that identifies identifies them as Nubian.
So they want to fit in, but they also want to make sure that there's something that retains the distinction, which is not particularly different than that. If I spend any appreciable time in the Southwest, at some point I'm probably going to wear a cowboy hat. But, most of the rest of my wardrobe is probably going to betray something else. Or at least my jeans would not be the jeans that a cowboy would wear. They're not going to be Wrangler or whatever. They're going to be some brand I have no idea about, but they're basically have the the pregnant woman waistband that they've managed to figure out that men could use those too. And no self-respecting cowboy would wear those. I'm not wearing cowboy boots. I'm wearing, loafers or driving moccasins or something. So it's probably something like that, but maybe more purposeful. It's maybe it's a badge of identification. Maybe it's even required in some places. Maybe a way to show someone, I'm with you. Who knows? Anyway, but what you're saying is that it was a melting pot then, and as long back as we can find civilization and culture, where there was trade, and then there's, always been melting pots. Even if it probably started with trade, or maybe it started with war, or maybe it started with, breeding and, marriages and maybe forced marriages or whatever it was. But anyway, the end result was a bouillabaisse. Even in Egypt, but of course, as you get further south, the bouillabaisse gets gradually darker just because that's the skin color of the folks that were there. And most people most people stay where they are, for the most part. Not everyone, but, if only 50% of the people stay where they are, that's going to be the dominant feature set. Try to say that as inoffensively as possible. I probably failed on every level, but anyway. All right. So, around what are we talking about? 6,000 BC? Are we sooner, earlier?
So 6,000 BC would be around the time of that Green Sahara when people were ranging around, and we do see some signs of complexity. So there's a place called Nabta in Egypt. Where they have even smaller than Stonehenge, but a little astronomical circle. Mm-hmm. It's quite small, but it did the job, which was figure out when the solstices were, equinoxes and things. So they were already thinking in terms of mapping out the movement of the stars and whatnot, connecting that maybe with, we don't really know, but maybe with seasons, but certainly with ritual things. And we see evidence of monumental tombs, so big, burials with these large stone arrangements on top of them, not super formal like a pyramid or whatever, but clearly something interesting going on in the desert. But as the desert dries, so it starts drying around 5,000 BCE, and that drying really hits an extreme around 3,500 BCE. That's exactly when we see Egypt ramping up to become, that what we think of as pharaonic civilization with everything. And it seems that a lot of these people from the desert moved into the Nile Valley at this time. And probably they'd always been going back and forth. And again, people move around a lot. But at that time, they were kind of forced out of the desert because it was less hospitable. Then they may have superheated developments in the Nile Valley. And that's when we see these small kingdoms developing. In Nubia, the A group, and then some kind of competition between them all. And we see Egypt emerging as the sort of main civilization along the Nile, and the A group kind of disappearing. And then things starting to develop farther south, a little bit later with Kerma. So that all happens around 3000 BCE, where we see these probably smaller kingdoms coalescing into a unified state in Egypt, under kings like Narmer and Scorpion, speaking of the rock. I think probably those early kings must have been kind of like the pro wrestler, it's really good posers and, kind of out there fighting. But anyway.
I have a lot of friends in pro wrestling, and especially the wrestlers there say everything is pro wrestling.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And then you see at Kerma, farther south, and this is a little bit later, let's say about 2600 BCE, we see that coalescing into something that gets more and more hierarchical and stratified. So by about 2200 BCE, we see something that looks like a kingdom. And by about 2000 BCE, we have royal tombs that are surrounded by arrays of 4,000 cow skulls.
Ooh.
Which is, presumably a giant feast that happened when one king died and a new king was coronated. But just clearly an indication of something centralized. And then by about 1700 BCE, we see them taking over what had been sort of a system of ancient Egyptian fortresses in Egyptian Nubia, the kind of hardened frontier right at the modern border between Egypt and Sudan at the second cataract of the Nile. And they push north and dominate Egypt for a while.
Cataracts are like sort of like whitewater, waterfall, rapid kind of things.
Yeah, exactly. It's when granite outcrops cross the bed of the Nile, and then so you create these rapids. It's an obstacle to travel along the Nile. So it's a good place to
natural border.
Yeah, exactly. Choke point. Put in a fortress there, and it makes it really hard for anybody to pass by without getting your permission.
Right. Your boat's gonna crash, or you're gonna pay our tax.
Exactly. Yeah, and then we'll help you through for a little consideration.
Right. Yeah. Give us those good cigarettes.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you bring the Swedish vodka this time, or whatever the equivalent is? Yeah. I get it. We're still the same.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that interests me is recognizing people in the past, as not being so different from us, but in a kind of cool new cultures, situations, so you can look at things that have disappeared, but people are still people.
Yeah, I mean there are some stark differences, but there are
differences for sure.
Yeah, like child sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But ultimately, people are people. But,
right.
And then at the as that kingdom was ramping up, they also practiced human sacrifice.
Awesome.
So, and again, it seems like they were like volunteers, if you will. Of course, we can never get in their minds. They may not have had a lot of choice,
right?
And just went along with it. But they probably took poison, and they're arrayed in these large corridors, and very carefully placed.
Right. So it probably wasn't like Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, where someone's out there kicking and screaming and they cut your heart out. They probably either drugged you up a lot so that you were having like an acid trip and didn't really know what was going on, period, or they gave you poison and you were already dead or on your way to dead.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Okay. Well, that's, anesthesia and going back to my silly Unsullied, comparison, probably these people from a young age were, taught that this was an honor. And if and it's not so different today. I mean, we're recording this March 8th of 2026, and people are worried about jihad, and jihad involves a lot of suicide bombing. And in World War II, they were kamikazes. I mean, and that was considered an honor. And I don't consider it an honor, but I also don't consider it cowardly. I think it's quite brave. So, I don't like that kind of braveness, but it's still a hard thing to do. But anyway, if you're raised or you're indoctrinated to think that something is an honor, then that's what you're going to think, especially if you believe that you're being shepherded in by true representative of the gods, and you believe that the gods are actually, sort of just past the veil or sometimes among us. Maybe lightning, I don't know, or other, aurora borealis type things. I don't know. Anyway, that's a lot of speculation. I have a silly question. Maybe it's not silly, from a while back, because you're talking about things like the solstices and the equinoxes, and all of that makes sense, except in the equator, there really aren't those things as much. I mean, it's sort of the same, but since there is in the rest of the world, would that tie to sort of like dry seasons and wet seasons? So you'd still need to track it anyway. I mean, I don't know if it would pair exactly with the same dates, but it'd probably be close enough for government work.
Yeah, exactly. So there's still, I mean, the seasons aren't as dramatic as they in Northern Europe, or it's more like where I live in California,
right,
where we don't have a huge change of season, but maybe even a little bit more because you had the flood of the Nile. So even when rainfall was no longer coming up north, I mean, when that kind of mini Stonehenge thingy that I was talking about was built in the desert, it would have been a time when there would have been a dramatic change of season. So you would have had a real rainy season, even seasonal lakes would have formed, some maybe even permanent water, standing water that would have been renewed, with each rain. But then by the time, the Sahara had dried and become more like it is today, then what you would have is the flood of the Nile.
Right. So he would have sort of the days or this
change of season.
Yeah.
Like shorter days and cooler, as opposed to really, really hot during the summer.
And I think those things are also tied to certain migrations of certain animals. I'm sure some of them were things, fish or birds, or whether they were used for eating or harbingers of something's coming that you eat, or, those, it's all connected in some way, shape or form. So I'm sure it would have been useful information.
Quite relevant.
Yeah.
And then you would have the movement of the stars. So, and, things like the moon, cycles of the moon, and so on, which they were very much attuned to.
Of course, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's also very important for the water and measurement of time, or really the time is the measurement of movement. I suppose that's about as good a definition as I found. I guess it's philosophical. If you're like in a Schrodinger's box and nothing's happening, you can still go 1/1000, 2/1000. I guess it just doesn't matter much if you're in a void. But that even sounds worse than the being entombed as a guard for the Pharaoh duty. So we're finding ever more horrible ways that Dr. Strange or Dr. Doom can sorcerer us into levels of hell that Dante couldn't have even dreamt of. All right. So what was the Black Pharaohs era? What did they call themselves? What houses did they establish when they took over rulership of Egypt, and who beat them up and chased them back?
Yeah, so the quote-unquote Black Pharaohs, I actually don't like that term because it sort of maps modern racial ideas onto the past, which didn't have those same conceptions.
Sure.
Even though they had a kind of recognition by the ancient Egyptians that people were darker to the south and lighter to the north, in line with those lines. Mm-hmm. So they had a concept of ethnicity, I would say, but not of race in that same way.
Well, what did they call it? Would they call themselves the Kushite pharaohs, the Nubian pharaohs, or were they like in Constantinople? We're Romans.
Yeah, so they did call themselves king of Kush.
Okay.
So they did refer to themselves as Kushites, but they also referred to themselves as just king of Egypt and Kush.
Sure, why qualify it? I'm king.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so they certainly presented themselves as the sort of saviors of Egyptian civilization, because at that point in time, when they gained control over Egypt, the Assyrians were looming in the Middle East on the horizon. They were pushing down into the Levant. So Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and kind of knocking at the gates, if you will. And in the Nile Delta, there were several competing dynasts who were squabbling and ruling amongst themselves. And in the south, though, you still had Thebes, which was a more unified polity. And the old idea is that they conquered Egypt. But in fact, I think the Thebans, who had long-standing ties with them, so during this colonial era, for example, we found evidence at the site I've been excavating of a strong connection with Thebes. And we see in the cult of Amun-Re, the Amun-Re seems to be sort of syncretized or blended or entwined with a Nubian god. And so he takes on a special manifestation of Amun of Napata, which is where this capital of this new kingdom was located, a little bit south right past the bottom of the Great Bend and up at what we call the Fourth Cataract of the Nile. So another area where it's difficult to travel, but up until then you could sail along the Nile quite nicely. And he is manifest as a ram. So we see this ram imagery connected with God Amun. And a mythology that this is where Amun was born and emerged from a sacred mountain called today Jebel Barkal, where there's a big temple to Amun. It was built during the period of New Kingdom Egyptian colonization, but then gets taken over by these Kushite kings, expanded and beefed up into the capital of this new kingdom. And so given those long-standing ties with Egypt, I think personally that they were actually invited to come in. And that seems to be the case. So we have a king named Pianki, whose sister was adopted in a very powerful title called the God's Wife of Amun. Basically think of her as a high priest or priestess of the deity. And that was, one of the most important cults in all of Egypt. And centered at Karnak, definitely the preeminent temple complex, huge amount of wealth and so on. That's a lot of power and authority. And that seems to have happened, kind of completely peacefully. There's no sign of a conquest. There is a stela, a victory stela of this king Pianki, but he seems to be suppressing a revolt among these petty dynasts in the Nile Delta, rather than invading. But Egyptologists will often refer to this as an invasion because, they believe Egyptian ideology too much of Nubians as others and enemies and so on. But in fact, they were, as I mentioned before, there were Nubians, in Egypt all the time, and they were, spent as much time as allies, sometimes as rivals, sometimes fighting. But in this case, they took over Egypt, and the South, when Pianki starts his military campaign, the South is firmly under his authority. And then when he goes up to the north, the Nile Delta basically is split away, and they're trying to push down and force these Kushite kings out, but they do not succeed. And Pianki sort of tells them off and says, you've got to swear fealty to me. And they say, okay. And things stabilize for a while. It's interesting because the Pianki spends a lot of his time visiting shrines and getting the approval of all the gods of Egypt and all these other things, just showing that I'm the good ruler. These guys, they don't know what they're doing.
Sounds like Alexander the Great,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then from then on, Kushite kings rule Egypt for about 100 years, until they run up against the Assyrians. And they were actually able to, it was pretty impressive because the Assyrians were already moving towards the Egyptian border. This is where you find references to Nubians in biblical tradition, because these Kushite kings, like Pianki and particularly Taharka, were allies of Hezekiah in Jerusalem, so the kingdom of Judah, and against the Assyrians.
Oh, right. He's the one who kept writing letters to the Pharoahs to saying, "My lord, I'm sure you haven't gotten my letter yet, and if you had, you would have sent 400 horses and 3,000 men. But of course, somebody has failed you along the way." Is that right, or is that a different pleading king, minor king?
That's a little bit earlier.
Okay.
So yeah, that's in the New Kingdom when the empire. These little rulers of city-states squabbling amongst one another, and everyone wants to get help from the Pharaoh.
Okay, maybe it was when the Hittites were threatening into Canaan. Okay, the Assyrians they were badder asser than the Hittites.
Exactly, and we do have a fairly powerful kingdom led by Hezekiah, based in Jerusalem, in the south. But the Assyrians were basically ruling over everybody. And the Kushites came up and fought a battle at a place called El Tek, probably in southern Israel today. And
when is this? Like 4,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago?
Yeah, it's about 2,700 years ago. So this is about 700 BCE.
Okay, so it's recent history.
Yeah. So we're getting much closer to modern time. So they fought a battle with the Assyrians. The Assyrians say they won, but then the Assyrians withdrew from the region. So you can read into that what you will.
Right.
It's like mission accomplished. Let's get out of here.
Yeah.
And so again, some things don't change a lot.
I think we made our point.
Exactly. Yeah. But so it appears that in one argument you can make is that these Kushite kings of Egypt, saved Jerusalem and came to Hezekiah's aid, but they managed to fight off the Assyrians for about 100 years. The time they were ruling in Egypt, which is pretty impressive because the Assyrians beat everybody.
Yeah.
Major kingdoms like Babylon, and so on. So the fact that the Egyptian, these Kushite kings, kind of Egyptian Kushite armies and whatnot, were able to hold them off that long was impressive. But nevertheless, they succumbed. So, the Kushites were pushed out of Egypt. Just to give you a sense of how loyal the Thebans were, they actually revolted against the Assyrian administration of Egypt. And then the last Kushite king, a guy named Tenutamani, came in and tried to recover, the Egyptian part of this Kushite empire, but eventually he was also defeated by the Assyrians, and then they were no longer. That was the last time they were in control of Egypt itself.
Isn't the Egyptians partly in response to that happening? I mean, in the northern Egyptians, they hired like a massive army of sort of Turkish bodyguards, probably like Mamelukes or something like that, and then they at some point took over Egypt for some period of time, or is that a complete fiction?
Yeah, a bit of a conflation maybe, because you did have Mamelukes in Egypt, but that's in the quite recent history, so the 19th century.
Oh yeah. No,
so there were eventually. I think what you're thinking of is that you do start seeing around this time, a little bit later, really, kind of, Persians roll in after the Assyrians. It's kind of after the Assyrians, hand things off to a loyal Egyptian dynasty, one of these Delta guys who came out on top for a while, but then the Persians conquer Egypt, and then there's an Egyptian dynasty that comes up. But around this time, the Egyptian kings started hiring Greek mercenaries.
Right.
And you also see the establishment of Greek colonies, trading colonies, in the Nile Delta. And so that probably helped usher in Alexander the Great when he defeated the Persians and eventually took over Egypt. He would have, encountered friendly groups of, various mercenary groups, but also, these Greek cities in the Delta. And then that all got ramped up with Greek control of Egypt. So this is, between, say, 600 and 332.
Well, talk about pro wrestling. The Greeks with the long-term booking starting to build these colonies like 4,000 years ago around the Black Sea and around the coast of, Canaan and then in Egypt. So, yeah, I mean, that's long-term planning.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And the Egyptians used some of the Greeks who were part of what people refer to. I think the Egyptians actually use this term, the Sea Peoples.
Yeah.
Were probably a bunch of Greeks. Think, Odysseus, right? Who actually, as part of the account, says he landed in the Nile Delta and the Egyptians chased him away.
Yes.
But some of these people were, initially fought against the Egyptians, but the Egyptians flipped them and incorporated them into the Egyptian army. And then later on, they settled in various parts of Egypt. So that even goes all the way back. That's about 1200 BCE. Between, let's say, 1200 and 1100 BCE.
Wow.
Is the
beware of Greeks bringing gifts.
Exactly so.
They can't even stabilize their own currency now. So, and then they don't even use their own currency. So, so I guess we don't have to worry about the Greeks for a while. Or maybe that's just what they want us to think. Everybody, keep your eyes on the Greeks.
Beware of big Greek, gifts.
And by the way, to the audience, I'm breaking the fourth wall now. I know I promised you a show on Greek mythology with Jimmy T, but as you know, with my long-term relationship with Jimmy T, is that he fails me all the time, and he failed again. So those of you who know Jimmy T, tell him that he failed and to do the show. However, that said, this would not have been the first show that I have done on Greek mythology over the last 7 years. So you can certainly find plenty with experts and lesser experts and authors and all sorts of things. There's even shows dedicated to certain gods and characters. So don't worry, Greek mythology is in this catalog, just not the one with Jimmy T. And this is because of his original failure when he and I did a live show on his network, and he impressed me with his knowledge so much, and then he lost the show. So Jimmy T, you stink. And you know it. So there we go. And Dr. Brown agrees. So, yeah, clearly he's shaking his head enthusiastically right now. So yeah, don't worry. He's in Melbourne, Australia. You'll never encounter him. So, or need to worry about it. So with that, now back to our main event after that commercial rant. I'm sponsoring my own rant this week. Anyway, so, all right. So that sort of brings us to, I guess, I mean, once you get to Alexander, then we sort of know after that comes, the breakup of Alexander and then the Romans and at that point we're basically, we're that brings us back to dough, so to speak. So is there, last question on this, and then I'm going to let you go, unless there's something that you absolutely need to bring up or feel like is important to clarify or embellish upon. But I have heard that there's like 2,000 pyramids in what we would now call Sudan, or what would then be Kush, Nubia, what have you. Are they just not known because that region has been in such bad state for such a long time, including North Sudan, South Sudan fighting and fighting within? Or are they like the oldest pyramids in Egypt, that they're smaller and just not as impressive as the ones from Giza? Or they've been destroyed, or a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B?
Yeah, a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B. So it's, part of it is they are smaller. They're still pretty impressive, though, but definitely like way smaller than the Great Pyramids at Giza, for example. There are a lot more of them, more royal pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt.
Do we think they're older or more recent, or around the same?
No, they're more recent. So okay. They were inspired. Part of it too is that Egyptologists have a tendency to be very Egyptocentric, and I say this as someone who qualifies as an Egyptologist too. But they tend to think of Nubia as a sort of pale imitation of Egypt, which is shortchanging Nubian civilization. So what they did was they often took Egyptian themes and ideas, and it's partly this idea of, I like to think of it in terms of entanglements. You can think of different threads weaving together, and part of those are people having children, but all cultures as well. So pyramids are a good example of this. So about the same time Egyptian kings stopped being buried under pyramids, high officials started building little pyramids for themselves. So typically made out of mud brick. We found a whole bunch of them in this colonial community from the New Kingdom at Tumbos, and it's exactly at this period. It's around 1500 BCE when you see the beginnings of the New Kingdom. There are a couple of early pyramids, and then they shipped to the Valley of the Kings and the big mortuary temples, no more pyramids. And that continues throughout the end of Egyptian history. But in Nubia, so you get these officials. So the ancient Theban necropolis would have been dotted with these little teeny pyramids. They still can be quite impressive if a couple stories tall or so. But definitely, not like a royal pyramid. And there's not much left of them. They tend to erode away. But in Sudan, and with Nubian civilization, especially when you see the shift over to the Meroitic civilization. So Meroe is a city ancient city that's closer to Khartoum. So around the Great Bend of the Nile, maybe a couple hundred kilometers north, downstream of Khartoum. And major Nubian capital. It's that civilization that kept ticking along after the Assyrians kicked them out of Egypt. They flourished in northern Sudan. And so they and actually even those Kushite kings who took over Egypt started being buried under small stone pyramids. And so these are less impressive monuments, but still, a kind of new thing, even though they look like an Egyptian monument that clearly are based not on royal pyramids in Egypt, but on these elite pyramids of colonial officials. And so you can see a lot of continuities where Egyptologists would like to see a break. In fact, you see this kind of colonial culture that's entangled. It's interweaving already different elements of Kushite civilization and Egyptian civilization in really interesting ways, but then creating new things. And I think you can see these new royal pyramids as a kind of new thing. So they look like one of these officials' pyramids, but they're made out of stone and they're several times the size. So as I say, they're still pretty impressive monuments. And in Merowe, there's a huge sort of royal cemetery with a whole bunch of these things. I don't know the exact numbers, but quite impressive. Decorated and with the burials of these later Kushite kings in them, with some really spectacular objects and things buried with them as well. So a really rich civilization that was kind of riffing off of Egyptian themes, but doing their own thing.
Where does the Nile then? Where does it end in the south?
The Nile itself?
Yeah, or where does it begin, I guess, technically?
Oh, yeah, so in Uganda, so Lake Victoria is the main source of the White Nile. And then the Blue Nile runs up into the Ethiopian highlands,
right,
or rather down from the Ethiopian highland. And so that would be its point. So it's more towards the east.
The east, right, sure.
And east and south.
Was this part of Uganda, was this considered part of Kush, or was this that Yam area that you were talking about? I mean, in other words, was there anything to the south of Kush that we've sort of encountered so far that would count as something historic to mention, so some sort of civilization?
Yeah, so far, no. Yam would be maybe the area around Lake Chad. It would be a possibility, but the archaeology needs to be done. But definitely in that area, kind of central Chad is the most likely place for it. And then Eritrea for Punt. But there's no mention of any place to the south.
Okay, interesting.
So again, there are indications that Kush extended a bit south of Khartoum. So a little bit into that southern area where the two, after the two Niles meet, and it's sort of a bit along both of those. There's some archaeological evidence that suggests that Kushite kingdom may have continued, or certainly there were spheres of influence, because you find a lot of things that are connected.
Is there any talk in the record of any of these places that we would talk about the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, or is that entirely biblical stuff?
It's primarily biblical, but it's generally connected with the Sabaean civilization in Yemen, and so that seems to be the reference to the Queen of Sheba would be from that area. And there was a polity around that time frame in there, an important kingdom in Yemen. Again, kind of sitting at the nexus of various trade routes, along the Red Sea, but also, especially that incense trade, because that was one of the big centers where they were producing frankincense and myrrh, which became extremely valuable, especially around the time of the Roman Empire, a bit later. But even before, in the time of Solomon, it would have been important. But it is kind of mythologized in the Bible, right? We don't know how much of that is exactly.
Is there any historical evidence for there being a Queen of Sheba or King Solomon? And I don't want to insult the major religions outside of the Holy Land. Is there any historical evidence for it whatsoever outside of biblical and like ancillary works?
Yeah, not that I know of.
Okay.
I don't know if there's any reference to Solomon. There are a few references to David that are maybe more indirect. Having said that, though, I wouldn't classify that as completely, mythological or like a parable. Some of the specific events connected with them may have been. But we know enough that there was a kingdom there, that more or less matches the biblical account. But the biblical account was being written hundreds of years after those events took place, so they are it's the Bible isn't a history book.
No.
So the main importance is
You haven't been on social media, my friend.
yeah, no, I know some people treat it that way, but
Yes.
but I don't think you can. Like the Exodus, for example, is clearly didn't happen the way it happened in the biblical account. We know this from Egypt,
If at all.
Yeah, exactly. We don't know. I think it's plausible to say that it was much smaller in scale. And there was a guy named Moses. And there were people like Midianites out in Sinai. So, and the one historical reference in the Exodus narrative is to the city of Ramses. And that actually is a real place. So that kind of gives you a little bit of this historical background. But then so much of the rest of the account is either exaggerated or updated to match, again, the time when it was being written down, probably around 700 BCE.
Well, I don't think anyone disputes that there were pharaohs named Ramses. The Greeks called him Ozymandias, and then he became a demon. And a lovely poem, which I still don't think the name quite fits, but it is haunting nonetheless. But I'm no literature expert either. All right. Is there something I should have asked you about, or in my meanderings I didn't allow you to get to, that is something that's on topic that a more educated or erudite host would know to have asked you about?
Yeah. I think we covered most of it. The one thing that I would just say, talking about Meroe and Meroitic civilization, this is another culture that was very much engaged with the Mediterranean world as well as that part of Africa. And so we find, Roman accounts of people coming in. And of course, the Romans portray them as a vassal state. But when you actually look at it, that's just saving face. They're probably, have a robust trade relationship. And we find like Roman objects and imitations of Roman objects there, as well as these amazing, sort of new kinds of monuments based on Egyptian ideas. And I'll just leave you with one of my favorite monuments from Meroitic Nubia, and that's a temple to the god Epidemic, who's a lion god. It's really fun. He dresses up like an Egyptian, but he's not an Egyptian god. He's a local god. And they really go to town with the lion symbolism. But on the pylon of that temple, so all ancient Egyptian temples had a kind of pylon. Think of a monumental gateway that's kind of like two mountains to side. So you can also look at it as a symbol of the sun rising and setting, because that's how Egyptian temples, they're kind of oriented with that solar symbolism of rebirth and going into the Duat and the sanctuary and so on, the netherworld and the starting place where the gods live. And on the front of it, typically you have the scene of the king slaying enemies. So there'll be a king. This goes all the way back to the Narmer Palette, the beginning of Egyptian history. The Nubians picked up on this and ran with it.
Sure.
But they have, on the one side, they have a king, and the king is sort of grabbing enemies like this and getting ready to whack them and execute them. And normally you just have a mirror image. You'd have a king on the left, king on the right. But in this case, it's the queen who's on the right-hand side, who's doing, her own grabbing enemies and whacking.
Oh, that's different. The queen's usually on the left.
Exactly, yeah. And so, and the queens are usually not shown with that kind of equality and not in that kind of position of power. It's very rare to see. In fact, the only queen I know who's shown smiting at all, and it's a very sort of minor thing, is Nefertiti, Akhenaten's queen.
Oh.
There's one representation of her. It's actually a depiction of a boat, like her state barge, and it has a little pavilion that she would have been sitting in, and there's a little image of her whacking enemies on it similarly. But this is on monumental scale, so there's a kind of equality between kings and queens. That's a real distinction from Egypt. It means in Egypt they're always in a secondary position behind the king, still a position of privilege, but typically shown a little shorter, sometimes really, really short, like Ramses. Nefertari, his queen, maybe comes up to his knee. In depictions. So,
yes.
So clearly, women are in a subordinate position, but here women are in a very much a position of equality. And in fact, could rule. There are quite a few of them who ruled as king. And so it's an interesting difference. They're also shown as shall we say, full-figured women. So
Yes.
very powerful, very substantial. So a different conception of beauty and feminine power that's really intriguing.
Not to be trifled with. Yeah.
Pardon?
Not to be trifled with, and that
Exactly so.
and that imagery seems to be consistent with sort of, the older world, so to the figurines that survive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's possible that all the Barbie figurines broke, but
Yeah.
All right. Well, since we are in Africa, so I'll excuse you for not mentioning the warrior queen Hippolyta. So it's obvious, Wonder Woman's mother. I mean, clearly real. So
there are a few. Well, there's Zenobia in Palmyra as well. It's faced off against the Romans, and there is another favorite of mine from Nubia, a queen named Amanirenas, who faced off against Augustus, and ended up defeating the Romans. The Romans tried to push into Nubia, and they were pushed back. And actually, the Nubians pushed into Egypt. And when they pushed into Egypt, they grabbed a beautiful bronze statue of Augustus, and decapitated it.
Ooh.
And then brought the head back to Meroe, where they buried it underneath the threshold of a temple celebrating her victory. And so as you walked across the threshold, you would literally trod upon the head of Augustus.
I'm sure he loved that.
Yeah. Yeah, he looks very startled. I've always thought that head looks very startled. Sort of,
yeah, I would imagine. I'm picturing a little bit like Medusa, right, as Perseus, sliced the head off kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they all
you can see it in the British Museum.
Of course. Where else would I see,
Where else would it be? Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Yes. I mean, as I'm sitting here in America, making fun of the Brits for that. So what do I know? Anyway, all right, fantastic. Last final question, but the least important one of all, but probably the one that'll trip you up the most, because that is my experience with guests, is what song would you attribute to this, or is in your head right now that sort of should be the outro of the show?
Oh, geez. That's a good question.
See, they can have all the PhDs in the world, but they're never prepared for this.
Yeah. I mean, my go-to for Egypt is "Walk Like an Egyptian," of course, by the Bangles.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's no songs about Walk Like the Kushites or Walk Like a Nubian.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's a good Nubia song. I mean, there's some Nubian music, which is really cool. Modern Nubian music, but I don't know if it really works for your podcast.
I don't know. If it's under 4 minutes, it's fine. It's an outro. It's nobody's tuning in for the outro. So listen, why don't you find one that's your favorite and just shoot it to me? And if it's as long as it's on YouTube or anything else that my wife can figure out how to edit in there, which is pretty much any format. She's the opposite of me. I can't figure out how to edit anything in, and she can figure out how to pretty much edit anything in. So anyway, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Stuart Tyson Smith. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate that. Appreciate the referral. I think it was it from Professor Hups or through one of his contacts?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was great.
Yeah, it was from Professor Hoops. So
yes, so thanks for that, Shane. As just listeners of the show know, the Professor's been on about 5 times probably, and I'm sure I'm just waiting till inspiration to strike me until I grab him again for something. Though right now I'm sure he's organizing No King's Lawrence protests and doing the Lord's work there. So anyway, the song, I don't know what it'll be, but it's going to be hip, new, modern, Nubian, and probably a little bit awesome, and probably new to almost all of you, and me as well. So enjoy that. Professor, where can people find and follow you if you want to be found and followed at all?
Well, I kind of curate my Facebook, so if I get random, requests, I typically don't add them. So I don't have a public-facing sort of social media presence. There is a website about our work in Sudan called, if you type in Tombos, TOMBOS.org, then you'll get the site, and it talks about our work in Sudan at this very interesting kind of ancient Egyptian colony, and has a lot of list of publications and whatnot. And then you could also find me in the Department of Anthropology at UCSB. So I do have a web page there, and I got links to some of the talks that I'd given, via Zoom or that were otherwise recorded, that people could check out if they wanted to, and a list of publications, including a couple of, sort of more public-facing publications that people have written about our work, journalists. So, I think I write pretty well for an academic.
Okay.
On the other hand, not everybody's flavor, so I do write for an academic community, but we do have a couple of things that were written, like as articles in magazines that are focused on ancient Egypt, but meant for the general public. So there are a few things there that they might be able to look at, including a couple of things about my movie book. So.
Excellent. That sounds like a lot of fun. So you're welcome back anytime if you want to talk about your movie work, or if you want to talk about the things that really irk you and you would like to debunk. I know that there's a lot of annoyance, anger, frustration in the archaeological and anthropological communities, science writ large generally, and want to push back. So I'm happy to put a platform for that, because we welcome everything here. That I've tried to scale back a little bit on the conspiracies and the fantastical stuff, or at least when doing it, know that at least I consider most of it to be conspiracy or fantastical stuff. So if you're here by accident or because you followed Dr. Smith here, thank you, welcome. This is Garden of Thought. You can subscribe on any audio podcast platform. Maybe one day we'll be on YouTube. Some of the shows are on YouTube on the Sports Jedi Network. They've been very kind and airing stuff, and I have been sharing some stuff with them, not nearly enough, but I have been. You can follow me on the X at Icarus Fell MD. There's shows like this. I did a deep dive with a science journalist and science writer on Babylon 5 and Battlestar Galactica, 2 different shows. So all sorts of stuff here, including Greek mythology. We can continue burying Jimmy T like Augustus's skull or a bronze statue over under the temple there. So that's fun. And I mentioned Jimmy T not just to bury him one more time, but also the transition into the world that everything is pro wrestling, because you have found the right podcast, because there are at least 50 episodes here with not just pro wrestlers as guests, but as co-hosts, where generally we're talking to someone else in pro wrestling, but usually not primarily about pro wrestling things. Sometimes it's very esoteric. Jimmy Jacobs on the Kabbalion, for Lord's sake. Damian Sando, Aaron Stevens, same guy, on the Freemasons, of which he is one. Of course, PJ Black / Justin Gabriel was the co-host during the Book of Black days. Now he's South African, very white though. And my most recent co-host, or most frequent co-host, is Mr. Thomas from MLW Wrestling, perennial #1 contender of something. And we might talk about where are the best cheesesteaks, and why is Waffle House awesome, and why don't white people use Cash App? So stuff like that. So anyway, variety like this, you're not even going to find on Joe Rogan. Forget it. Don't even try. And I won't make you feel like you're. No, I don't know. I'm not going to. I'm going to stop myself right there. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for being here. Listen to the listen to the Nubian music all the time. Doctor, thanks again. Everyone,
You're very welcome.
See you next time.
ready.